We're so excited that you're here today. We're going to talk about what is ADHD. If you heard anything on social media about ADHD, you'll hear it described as when you consistently forget your keys or miss appointments. And that couldn't be further from the truth. ADHD is really a complex difference in how we regulate attention, not a lack of it. So in this video, we're going to go into how clinicians diagnose ADHD and what they specifically look for, as well as what does the DSM-5 say about ADHD, and how do symptoms evolve and change over time. So the symptoms that you have as a child may not be the exact same symptoms you have as an adult. We're also going to look at the 3 different ways that ADHD presents. So there's a lot of misconceptions about how ADHD presents, and there are 3 different ways that it shows up. So we're going to cover a lot of those topics today. The point of this video isn't for you to be able to diagnose yourself or others, but to really remove some of the myths and some of the misunderstandings around ADHD so we can better understand our brains and those around us. So before we dive into how ADHD is diagnosed, let's look at the 3 ways it presents. A lot of times people assume that ADHD presents the same way every time, and that's just not the truth. We have 3 different ways ADHD presents. The first of that is predominantly inattentive presentation of ADHD. This looks like difficulty maintaining focus or forgetting instructions and maybe appearing to space out. It's actually interesting that in DSM-4, this was actually called ADD. But as part of DSM-5, it now has been identified as a way or presentation of ADHD. And that's really where some of those changes came in. A lot of times this looks like laziness or lack of motivation, especially in women and children. But that couldn't be further from the truth. This is really about a difference in regulation of attention and how people tend to focus. So predominantly inattentive ADHD is when your brain struggles focusing, where you can bounce from tab to tab to tab, where it seems like you have hundreds of tabs open. You can't just focus on one. Or you have a brain that will focus on multiple things at the same time and really struggles in some environments to really focus in and concentrate on one thing at a time. Now, it's really different from type 2. Type 2 is predominantly hyperactive and impulsive ADHD. We see fidgeting, restlessness, excessive talking and interruption of others, maybe impulsive decision-making or actions. This is what we recognize as the stereotypical ADHD, what we tend to think of. Like you're consistently powered by a battery, and no matter what you do, you can't stop. This can be standing up in meetings, jumping around, climbing trees, not able to sit down, outbursts in class. It really can present in a lot of different ways. And the third, and actually most common type of ADHD, is a combination where you have both the mental hyperactive and then the physical hyperactive. It can be a mix of distractions, impulsivity, forgetting tasks, easily burnt out. This is the most common, and people assume that it's worse because you have both symptoms, but that's actually not really how it presents. So it's important for you to remember as you interact with people that there's different ways ADHD can present. Just because we're stereotypically used to seeing the hyperactive impulsive ADHD, it doesn't mean that that's the only way it presents. And someone can be very calm and not physically active or bouncing off the wall and still have ADHD. It's just a different way it presents. So with that in mind, let's dive into the DSM-5 and how we begin to evaluate all 3 of these ways ADHD presents. So what is the DSM-5 and how does it help us better understand ADHD? Well, DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It is what clinicians use to evaluate any mental disorder in the United States. We're currently in version 5. Every so often, they do update this manual to include the most recent research to make sure it is current. The 5th version was released in 2013. When we look at the DSM-5, it has a couple different areas of criteria for ADHD. First, there's general criteria. You have to check all of these general criteria boxes in order to be diagnosed with ADHD. The first is it must present before the age of 12. So if you have symptoms that mirror ADHD but only presented in adulthood and weren't present in childhood, then you can't officially be diagnosed with ADHD. There's generally something else that can help explain those situations. The next general criteria would be it needs to appear in 2 or more settings. So home, school, work, relationships. If you only have ADHD symptoms or issues in one setting, it can be very environmental. So maybe it's stimuli in that setting or in that area, but in order to be officially diagnosed with ADHD, it needs to be in more than one setting. So struggles at work, struggles at home, struggles in a relationship or school, we need to present in two or more of those situations. The third of the general criteria is it must cause impairment. So this is really important because just because you have ADHD symptoms, but maybe you learn to adapt to them, you adjust to them, or you create environments where they work in, and they no longer are considered clinically impairing you, that can actually change your ADHD diagnosis. So it has to have some sort of clinical impairment in how you function in work, social situations, or in school. And then the last one is it can't be explained by any other disorder. So the 4 criteria that have to be checked off in order to be diagnosed with autism, according to the DSM-5, are symptoms must present before the age of 12. It must appear in 2 or more settings, home, school, work, relationships. These symptoms have to cause some sort of impairment, and it can't be explained by any other disorder. So after that, the DSM-5 really starts to look at symptoms list. So we talked earlier about the 3 different ways that ADHD presents, and that is really present in the DSM-5 as well. So there's a symptom list for inattentive ADHD and a symptom list for hyperactivity and impulsive ADHD. So when we begin to look at those things, here are the 9 symptoms for inattentive ADHD. If you look through that list, it can talk about failing to give close attention to details or making careless mistakes, right? It talks about difficulty organizing tasks and activities, where you have to remember that all of these symptoms that you're checking off have to be present before the age of 12 as well into adulthood if you're over that. So one of the most recent updates in the version of the DSM-5 that released in 2013 was that for children, you need to have at least 6 of these symptoms, and for adults, you only have to have 5. So as you look through this list, you don't necessarily have to check off all 9 from each list, but if you have 5 symptoms as an adult or 6 symptoms as a child, you would be considered having ADHD. So I'm not going to take time to review every single one of these. We're going to look through the list of inattentive ADHD and hyperactive-impulsive ADHD. And then if you're looking at combined, maybe you have a couple from one list and a couple from another list, and that would be considered combined ADHD, which once again is the most common. Let's take a deeper look at a couple of those symptoms to talk about what they really mean, just to make sure there's no confusions. Inattentive examples are the ones we're going to go through first. In inattentive ADHD, they talk about difficulty organizing tasks and activities. A lot of times people think this means that I'm just a little messy or I don't make a list. And that couldn't be further from the truth. What this really means is that you struggle to break big projects down into smaller steps. So it can be trouble prioritizing tasks, maybe get lost in priorities, not knowing where to start, and then you tend to just shut down. So a lot of times with the ADHD brain, when it gets overwhelmed, it chooses nothing rather than too much. It also will misjudge time. And in misjudging time, we can think that something takes a lot less time than it does. So we might say, I'm going to push that task off because I have plenty of time to complete it. In actuality, it's something that you need to start right away to get done. So that's really what we mean when we talk about difficulty organizing tasks and activities. This is really where we come down to executive functioning. In ADHD, we see a lot of executive functioning challenges. In this particular one, we're talking about the brain's ability to create a plan and stick to it, to prioritize, to execute. It's so much more than just a messy desk or a messy space. It's about how we complete activities and tasks. It's about how we prioritize things, and we can break large steps down into smaller ones to then make them more doable or struggle with that. Another example I want to go through in the inattention ADHD symptoms is avoids or dislikes tasks that require sustained mental effort. A lot of times people think that this just means I don't like boring tasks. And that's true for everyone. When we find tasks boring, we tend to avoid them or push them off to later. And that's not necessarily a symptom of ADHD. That's something that we all do. But for an ADHD brain, sustained mental effort can actually be physically painful, not just mentally painful. It's very difficult for us to focus on one specific thing for a long time because we're fighting our brain's natural desire to flip between tasks. This makes it really great for big picture, quick thinking when you need an immediate example to take in a lot of information, but it also means that we can slip up on details. And when we try to really focus on details, it can become physically painful and it can cause us a lot of distress. So, this isn't about being lazy or just putting off things that make you bored. This is about an actual barrier to create some sustained mental effort. But there are things that we can do to learn to do this and to build up this strength, just like any other muscle. We can learn to become better at this, even though we may not ever be exceptional at this. There are ways we can maybe hack our brain or adapt a little bit in this area. The next inattention example I want to cover is easily distracted by external stimuli. So this isn't really when you're like, oh, I got distracted by my phone and I scrolled social media for an hour. That's not really what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is with the ADHD brain, distractions aren't occasional, they're consistent. And it's not necessarily big things that distract, like a loud TV or social media or something booming. It can be the small things, like a fan consistently running, or the AC on, or maybe the flush of a bathroom, or things like that can be really overwhelming. Even down to the brightness of lights and the buzz of lights or the smells that come from a kitchen. Any sort of these external stimuli can be incredibly distracting for the ADHD brain. And while we find that a lot of people can just tune these out and are no big deal and are easily able to just flush these away, we find it very difficult for the ADHD brain to focus on anything else but them. It's like consistent input that they can't control and that they're always processing, which, as you can imagine, makes it very difficult for them to continue to focus in that long term. So on top of physical pain with sustained mental concentration, external stimuli can make that even more difficult. So let's take a moment and go through a couple symptoms for the hyperactivity impulsivity type of ADHD. The first one I'm going to cover is talks excessively. When we talk about talks excessively in ADHD, it's not that I'm just too chatty. That's not really quite it. It comes down to an impulsivity and a filter issue. So impulsivity and hyperactivity at the same time can drive brains to kind of break the system and not realize that they've said too much until it's mid-sentence, or not realize that their actions are impulsive until it's a little too late. So it's kind of like their filter happens behind what they say instead of in front of it. So there's not an internal filter that stops these things. Their impulsivity pushes it through until it's a little too late. So this can be interrupting mid-sentence, not being able to wait until someone else's complete thought is finished. A lot of times with people with ADHD, feel like everyone else is talking really slow because they already understand the end of someone's sentence and they want to get on to the next thing before this thought flips out of their mind. And they also can interrupt mid-sentence. They can share too much. Maybe they are impulsive or blurt things out in social situations. And that's really what we're looking at when we talk about excessively talking, not necessarily too chatty, but more the interruptions, the oversharing, the blurting things out, the not letting people finish their thoughts. The next one I really want to go through on this type of ADHD is blurts out answers and interrupts. I know this goes right along with talking excessively, but a lot of times this is seen as rude or disrespectful to others, and I understand why it feels that way. But once again, it's that regulation and that filter that they're struggling with. They have the knowledge, and in their mind, these thoughts are already complete, and they're just trying to kind of push it forward to make sure and drive the rest of the world to catch up with their brain. So they're always 3 steps ahead of the people around them. Mentally, they've already completed thoughts and finished things, and they really want to make sure that they have a chance to say what they want to say and to be a part of this conversation before it just slips out of their mind, because their mind's already moving on to the next thing. So it's not about disregarding or involuntary control. This, once again, is part of executive functioning and being able to slow down and filter their information and let the world catch up to them and hold on to their thoughts before they slip away too much. And the next one I want to talk about is restlessness in adults. I know when we picture ADHD, we picture the stereotypical kid running around nonstop, powered by that battery. But what does it really look like in adults? Adults, it can be really different. The hyperactivity doesn't disappear, it evolves. So this is maybe the adult who taps the pen during a meeting or jumps up as soon as it's over to be able to stretch and walk around. The one that's consistently asking to go to the bathroom. So not because they necessarily have to use the restroom, but because they want to move around, get out of the situation, get out of the meeting, maybe, and be a little free. So while we see this restlessness in kids, we also see it in adults. It's just presented a little differently. So this is really when we talk about the DSM-5 and those lists of 9 symptoms for each type, this is really what we're talking about, not the surface level, I'm too messy or I'm too chatty, but the deeper executive functioning challenges behind those things. Now that we understand what the DSM-5 says about ADHD and really a little more information about how those symptoms actually show up, I want to take a moment. I want to talk about the misconception that ADHD just goes away as you become an adult. It was commonly believed that you would outgrow ADHD after adolescence, and this was predominantly a childhood disorder. And that thought process really changed the DSM-5 that came out in 2013. But that doesn't mean that the symptoms stay the same. They evolve and begin to change. And some of these changes really can be very interesting. So in inattention in childhood, we see maybe a kid daydreaming in class or forgetting homework or leaving toys all over the place. But in adulthood, instead of forgetting homework, maybe it's forgetting deadlines or missing appointments, forgetting to pay bills or return email. The inattentiveness is still there. It just shifts from play to schoolwork and maybe household management. In hyperactivity with children, we'll see running around consistently and unable to stay seated or blurting things out. With adulthood, that does begin to change, and we see hyperactivity lessens, but it shows up more in restlessness, fidgeting, consistently switching, clicking a pencil or playing with a fidget toy, overfilling a schedule, not being able to sit down and rest. Adults often will feel like they can't relax or they have to always be doing something. So that hyperactivity is still present. It just changed. It just shifted a little bit. Same with the impulsivity. We'll see children interrupting teachers or grabbing other kids' toys or saying things without thinking. But in adulthood, it looks more like maybe making risky financial decisions or interrupting colleagues, impulsively changing jobs or relationships. It's less about playground behavior and more about life choices in adults. And then we'll also see maybe emotional regulation changes. In kids, we can see frequent tantrums or frustration over small setbacks, or maybe they're labeled as being overly sensitive. But in an adult, that shows up as rejection sensitivity, struggling to receive feedback, taking everything very personal, not understanding when something's truly about them or just maybe about a situation or the environment, as well as difficulty handling criticism. This really can affect your workplace, your relationships, and even some sort of friendships as well. So while the types of symptoms that show up are the same, they do evolve over time, and we can begin to see those things shift and change. I think it's really important to know that these symptoms don't go away over time, that ADHD is so much more than missing your keys, forgetting your keys, and not attending appointments. It's really about executive functioning and different on how we regulate attention. But it's really important to know that this is not laziness and this is not carelessness, and that there are things that you can do to better set up your brain for success. We can begin to work with how our brain functions once we truly understand what is actually happening in our brain, where our strengths are and where we begin to struggle, and how we can really hack our situation to set ourselves up for success. So I'm so glad that you've attended this training with me. As you begin forward, I really want you to think about how ADHD can show up in your life or maybe those around you. And what can you do to better accommodate yourself or maybe those coworkers or friends who are showing a lot of these symptoms.